Hello, everyone. In this chapter, we're going to discuss the 10 principles of economics. You can divide the 10 principles of economics on the field of study that teaches us microeconomics and on the field of study that teaches us macroeconomics. So we have these 10 principles of economics, and 7 are related to microeconomics, and 3 are related to macroeconomics. So in the 7 principles of microeconomics, we're going to talk about how individuals make decisions and how individuals interact. And in the portion that describes how the macroeconomy works, we're going to talk about how the economy works as a whole. As we discussed in the previous slide, we're going to talk about what kind of questions does economics address, what are the principles of how people make decisions. That is the portion of the 10 principles that talk about microeconomics. And then the second portion or the second category would be what are the principles of how people interact. These both, how people make decisions and how people interact, make up the study of microeconomics, and then we have the study of macroeconomics, that describes the principles of how the economy works as a whole. In this slide, we're going to talk about what are the topics that economists study. So economics is a very broad field. So we study things, for example, like how people decide how much they work, what they buy, how much they save, and how they invest their savings. All that has to do with individual decision making. Then they also study questions like how firms decide how much to produce and how many workers to hire. And then in the last category, these are examples of questions related or topics related to macroeconomics that are how society decides to divide its resources between national defense, consumer goods, protecting the environment, and other needs. So these are right now we're going to give a quick overview of the principles that are relevant to category one. Category one is how people make decisions. So the principles are, first principle is people face trade-offs. We can't have everything that we want, right? If we want something, we must give up something else. So individuals always face trade-offs. Then principle number two is the cost of something is what you give up to get it. In economics, we don't care much about the accounting costs, but what we care about more is something called opportunity cost. That is what you must give up in order to get something else. Principle number three talks about how people make decisions at the margin. So in economics, we believe that people are rational. So we will describe what we mean by having rational people, and we believe that rational people think at the margin. And then the last category, or the last principle, that is principle number four, is that economists believe that there is no problem that can't be solved without designing the proper incentive. So people always respond to incentives. The only problem is that sometimes incentives have unintended consequences. So these are four principles that are related to category one of how people make decisions. Okay, now let's start discussing principle one in detail. Um, to get something that we like, we have to give up something else that we also like, right? For example, if we're going to the party the night before an exam, then we're going to have less studying and we may fail our test, right? If we would be having more money to buy stuff, right? If we work more hours, but that takes time for leisure, or it also takes time from working, right? That's a very important trade-off that casting Fullerton students face. Um, a lot of you have jobs, full-time jobs, but you know that if you pick up an extra shift during the week, then you're going to be able to study less for your exam, right? Or also a very important trade-off that the whole world faces is protecting the environment. If we protect the environment, then often that comes often at having less resources that could be used to produce goods and services, right? So it's costly to protect the environment because we're using less efficient use of our resources for consumption goods, right? But at the same time, we will be protecting the environment and we will be protecting our future generations, right? So everything comes as a trade-off. People face trade-offs all the time. You cannot go to the movies and have dinner, right? You cannot clean our house at the same time that you are studying, right? You cannot go to work you want to spend many hours studying and get a good GPA, right? So we're always trying to compare competing objectives because we always face trade-offs, right? If I, for example, this summer, I would like to go on vacation, right? But if I go on vacation, then I'm gonna spend my savings, right? Maybe the whole year I've been saving, and I could put that money for retirement in my retirement account, or I could put that money away for my kids' college, or I would spend it and then I would spend it on a vacation, right? So I can't have both. We always face trade-offs. People always face trade-offs. But not only people face trade-offs, but the society faces trade-offs again. Also, there is a very important trade-off that societies face. That one has to do with national defense, right? The more it spends on national defense to protect from foreign aggressors, the less it can spend on consumer goods to raise the standard of living, right? So the government only has one budget, right? And they need to decide how to spend it, but if they end up spending too much in national defense, then they're only going to be able to spend little in education, right? Or in infrastructure, right? So they need to allocate their resources wisely because they know that they cannot spend on everything that they would like, right? Same as pollution regulations, cleaner environment and improved health, but at the cost of reducing the well-being of the firm's owners, workers, and customers, right? So we always face trade-offs, and we can get what we want, even as a society as a whole. A very important trade-off in economics, and something that is going to be asked that you know in the exam, is a trade-off between efficiency and equality. Efficiency is how society gets the maximum benefit from its scarce resources. So if if the resources in an economy were a cake, so let's suppose that we only have a cake for everybody to share and to eat. When we are getting the maximum benefit from our scarce resources, we're making the cake bigger with the same resources that we have in the economy, right? We're getting better technologies in order to produce goods and services. So we're making we're getting the maximum benefit from our scarce resources. So that will make our cake or our pie bigger, right? But that doesn't have to do, or that doesn't guarantee equality, right? Equality is when prosperity is distributed uniformly among society members. So if you have this cake, it's not how you make the cake bigger, but equality refers to how would you divide that cake equally, right? You distribute resources uniformly among society's members, right? So sometimes there's some trade-off between efficiency and equality, right? There could be policies that promote equality, but they do not promote efficiency, right? So one policy right now that we know that could promote equality but not efficiency was the unemployment supplemental insurance during COVID, right? So during COVID, many of us were sent home, right? And unfortunately, some of us lost our jobs during COVID, right? So when people lost their jobs, they were able to collect unemployment insurance from the state, but the federal government decided that we also needed a supplemental insurance in order to support ourselves and our families, right? So what they did is that they provided unemployment checks from the state, but also supplemental insurance from the federal government. And sometimes those two checks would be more than the checks that people would make on a regular salary at their jobs, right? And that is great because we needed it at that time. A lot of people could not work. A lot of people were sent home, and there was nothing to do because uh, everybody had to be at home, right? we could not go out, we could not find a new job. So it was very necessary to have those two unemployment checks. But at the same time, once the lockdown ended, and once we were able to go out and find a new job, a lot of people waited until the unemployment insurance ran out in order to get another job, right? So definitely these unemployment checks promoted equality, and during COVID they were very necessary. But then in the end, they disrupted the economy, and they discouraged people from getting a job right away, and they decreased efficiency in the economy because a lot of people that could have been working, they were at home waiting for their unemployment checks to run out, right? So there's many policies that promote equality but could decrease efficiency, or vice versa, right? There's policies that promote efficiency, but they may not promote equality, right? Now we will discuss principle number two. That is, the cost of something is what you give up to get it. Okay. So in economics, we believe that what is important is the opportunity cost. Cost is whatever must be given up to obtain some item. Okay. So in economics, we're always comparing cost and benefit of alternatives. But we also need to include the opportunity cost, right? Because we may get a benefit from some kind of action, but at the same time there is an opportunity cost for that action, and we need to figure out what is that. So for example, if you think about going to college for a year, you can think, what is the cost of going to college? Well, you have to spend on tuition, books, and fees, right? You will have to spend on room and board, right? You would have to probably have some foregone earnings, right? But what is the opportunity cost from all these alternatives? So tuition, books, and fees, that's a cost of going to college, but that's not the opportunity cost. Room and board, you're spending money on that anyway, right? You have to live somewhere. You have to rent an apartment even if you're not going to college. But the third option, that is, excuse me, foregone earnings, that is the opportunity cost of going to college, right? Instead of being here listening to this video, you could be working some extra hours to make an extra money at work, right? You could have picked up an extra shift, right? Instead of actually attending the university during the regular fall session, right? But so what you're doing is that you're foregoing earnings for attending college, and that's the opportunity cost of going to college, right? Or what is the opportunity cost of going to the movies? If you go to the movies, again, if you go to the movies, you're probably going to spend money on your movie ticket, but that is not your opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is that what you could be doing instead of going to the movies, right? That could be either working, or it could be studying, or it could be working out, or it could be spending time with your dog or your brother or your sister, right? So those are all opportunity costs, or what you could be doing instead of actually sitting down in the movie theater and watching a 2-hour movie. Now that we discussed opportunity cost, we have to talk about principle number three. So principle number three says that rational people think at the margin. So first, let's define what is rationality in economics. You're gonna see in the next few seconds that even when economists believe that people are rational in the economy, you see that not everybody is rational in the economy, but economists work under the assumption of rationality. So what is rationality? So rational people are systematically and purposefully doing the best that they can to achieve their objectives given the available opportunities and also given the available information that they have. So rational people make decisions by evaluating costs and benefits of marginal changes. So they make small incremental adjustments to a plan of action. Okay. So think about it. So economists think that we're always doing our best to achieve the objectives that we have in mind, given the available opportunities and available information. Are we trying our best all the time? Not really, but that's what economists believe. So now that we believe that people are rational, then uh, uh, economists believe that rational people think at the margin. So how does this work? Let's talk about thinking at the margin. So I am going to tell you the story of what I tell all my students every year. So every morning I go to Starbucks. And then when I go to Starbucks, I plan to buy a coffee, right? Every morning at 7:30, I stop by Starbucks and I buy my coffee. I pay the price of that coffee, which is a little bit steep, closer to $4, right? But for my first morning coffee, it's definitely worth it. For my first coffee, the marginal benefit definitely exceeds the marginal cost that is close to $4, right? But then later in the morning, in the late morning, sometimes I feel like a second coffee. And then I go to the Starbucks and then I think about it. And then I realize that the marginal benefit of having this second coffee does not exceed the marginal cost that is $4, right? So that's where I stop. So I'm willing to buy my first coffee even if I have to pay $4, but I'm not willing to pay $4 for my second cup of coffee, right? So that's why we always make incremental decisions. And at each incremental decision, we must compare the marginal benefit to the marginal cost. Or in your case, that's something that you also probably deal with. So let's think about your classes. So you start making up your schedule for the fall semester, right? And then you think, okay, first I want to take a management class, so that's okay. And then I'm going to take a marketing class, and then that's fine, that's my second class. And then the third class, I need to take accounting, and you start doubting it because it's already your third class and it's an accounting class that may be kind of difficult. But you say, I think I can handle it. And then the fourth class, okay, I need to take econ. Should I take it? Okay, fine. I'm gonna make an effort. I'm gonna pick one less shift at work, and I'm gonna work really hard this semester, right? But then once you've already picked four classes, would it be wise, or would the marginal benefit of taking calculus would exceed the marginal cost? And the answer is no, right? Once you've already taken four classes, it may not be a good decision to pick this extra calculus class, right? In that case, the marginal benefit would not exceed the marginal cost. The marginal cost would be too high because you would have to give up a lot of shifts. You would have to stay at home when your friends are going out, right? You would have to work super hard and maybe get a tutor for the calculus class once you've already taken four classes. Okay, so we have another two examples for the publisher. Let's look at them. As a manager of the local Save a Lot, you're thinking of hiring one more cashier that it would increase sales revenue by $400 per week. The new cashier would earn $300 per week. Should you hire the new cashier and why? Well, the marginal benefit of the extra cashier is $400 in sales revenue, but the marginal cost is only $300. In this case, the marginal benefit of this extra cashier in, exceeds the marginal cost that is $300, right? So the answer is yes, we must hire this extra cashier. Okay. Now let's read the second example. It says you pay $12 a month for access to Netflix, regardless of how many movies or TV shows you watch in a month. Should you watch one more movie or episode and why, right? Well, the marginal benefit of watching one more episode is the satisfaction, the fun, the time off, everything else that you're getting from watching this extra movie or extra show. And the marginal cost is zero, right? You already paid $12 a month for access to Netflix. Watching one extra movie would not increase your marginal cost, right? So that means that yes, you should watch the movie, right? Because the marginal cost would not increase because it would be zero, and the marginal benefit would be the satisfaction that you're getting from watching this extra movie or extra show. Finally, we will discuss principle 4 of category 1 of the principles of economics. So principle 4 says that people respond to incentives. First of all, what is an incentive? An incentive is something that induces a person to act. And but it also can have unintended consequences, right? So people respond to its incentives because rational people make decisions by comparing cost and benefits. So if there is something that is encouraging us to take a specific course of action, then that would be an incentive, right? It could have, like I said, unintended consequences. So an increase in the price of the donut would cause consumers to buy fewer donuts, but the sellers would produce more donuts as well, right? Because prices act as incentives. When prices go up, producers want to make more of a specific good, but when prices go up, consumers decrease the quantity demanded for that specific good, right? So we have an example of how people respond to incentives. So the government increases the gasoline tax by $1 per gallon. So how do consumers respond? So let's think about this for a second. So when people show up at the at the pump, right, and they're gonna get their gas, and they see that it's $1 more expensive, they can't do anything about it, right? When tomorrow, every time I go to the gas station, there could be a change in the price of gas. You know that that's possible, but then initially you can't really do anything, right? But then after a while, when you start seeing that gasoline starts increasing, then people change the way that they behave, right? So they start thinking, okay, well, we need to buy a smaller car, right? Or maybe buy a Tesla or an electric vehicle of other type, right? So you need to buy a car that consumes less gas, right? Or maybe I can carpool with my neighbor, or I can take my neighbor kids to practice, and then it's her turn again, so that we're not both driving in that direction, right? Or maybe if the cost of public transportation hasn't changed, maybe we decide to take public transportation. And if it's just too much and gas is way too expensive, the last thing that we probably do is you just move closer to work, right? If the gas is way too expensive, you're spending too much money on gas, maybe it's just better to use that money to pay additional money on rent and move closer to your workspace, or to your school, right? In the previous slide, we have the following example. You're selling your black 1967 Chevy Impala. You have already spent $2,000 on repair. At the last minute, the transmission dies. You can pay $1,400 to have it repaired, or sell the car as is. In each of the following scenarios, should you have the transmission repaired? Let's explain. So for scenario one, the blue book value, what you could get for the car is 14,500 if the transmission works, and 11,200 if it doesn't work. Okay? And then in the second scenario, the blue book value is 12,300 if the transmission works, and 11,000 if it doesn't work. Okay? So the cost of fixing the transmission is $1,400. Okay? So the blue book value is 14,500 if the transmission works, and 11,200 if it doesn't work, right? So we have 11,200 if it doesn't work, and 14,500 if the transmission works. So the benefit of fixing the transmission would be $3,300, right? So we would take the 14,500, and then this would be the what you would get if the transmission doesn't work, right? So the benefit would be 3,300. But the cost of fixing the transmission is only $1,400. So in that case, you would get the transmission fixed, right? Because you will get some extra money from fixing the transmission, right? But in the second scenario, the blue book value is $12,300 if the transmission works, and 11,000 if it doesn't work. So the benefit of fixing the transmission would be 12,300 minus 1,100, right? So the benefit would be, let me tell you the number. The benefit would be 12,300 minus 1100, 12,300 minus 1100. The benefit would be 1,300. But to fix the transmission is 1,400. So in that case, it's not worth it to fix the transmission, right? Because when you fix the transmission, the benefit that you would be getting is smaller than the cost of fixing the transmission. Now we will discuss the principles related to category number 2 of macroeconomics, that is how people interact. So there are three principles related to this category. The first one is talks about trade and how trade can make people better off. The second one talks about markets being usually a good way to organize economic activity. And then the third principle related to this category is governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. So this principle number 5 is trade can make people better off. Let's think about it for a second. Let's suppose that we go one day on a boat trip and then we end up being lost at sea and then we end up in an island where nobody lives there. Okay, so if we live in this island, then we're going to have to catch our own fish, make our own home, uh, look for water, and make some fruits, and make our own clothing, and we have to provide everything for our livelihood, right? We would have to make everything to eat, our own shelter, and so on. So that would be definitely very inefficient, right? It would take a very long time to be able to learn how to catch fish and how to make your home and how to sew your own clothes, etc. Right? But when people trade, people can enjoy a greater variety of goods and services at a lower cost, right? So when there's trade in the economy, people specialize on what they do best and then trade the goods and services that they produce, right? So this allows countries to specialize in what they do best, and they that way will have a greater variety of goods and services. Principle number 6 talks about markets. And we believe in economics that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. But first of all, what is a market? So, a market is a group of buyers and sellers that meet in order to trade goods and services, right? So, there could be thousands of buyers and thousands of sellers that meet to trade goods and services, like we said. And it doesn't really have to be in a single location, right? Right now we have malls where you can have buyers and sellers, and you have shopping centers, but you also have online markets, right? So what constitutes a market is a group of buyers and a group of sellers, right? What do we mean by organized economic activity? Well, that means that through the market structure, then we're deciding what goods and services are produced in an economy, right? But we also decide through this market economy who gets to produce these goods and services and how to allocate it to their final user, right? So in market economy, resources are allocated through the decentralized decisions of many firms and households as they interact in markets. So resources, the way that we know what resources goes to what entity is through the decentralized decisions of many firms and households. So there is not one entity that is in charge of deciding what gets to be produced and what gets to be consumed in an economy, right? And even when markets are not perfect, definitely, they're proven remarkably successful in organizing economic activity to promote overall prosperity, right? So we know that they're not perfect, but do we think that it's a good way to allocate resources in the economy? So what is determined in markets are prices, right? Prices is like the baton for an orchestra that is going to guide the allocation of resources. So it turns out that if you remember your perfect competition topic that you covered in Eco 202, you can see that prices, or you remember that prices are determined by the interactions of many, many buyers and many, many sellers, right? So we see that where buyers and sellers meet, that's the price that is going to be prevail in the market for a specific good or service, right? So this has a lot of information, right? It reflects the goods value to buyers, but it also reflects the cost of producing the good, right? So it's obvious that it definitely reflects the cost, but the value is not so obvious, right? For example, I always tell my students, think about the iPhone that we use, right? So when a new iPhone comes out, then it costs over $1,000, right? Do you really think that it cost Apple $1,000 to, or close to $1,000 to produce this iPhone? And the answer is no, right? The answer is that it most likely also, to a to a great extent, reflect the goods value to buyers. Okay, so in market economies have been studied for many, many years. So Adam Smith, that is the father of modern economics, he came up with this concept called the invisible hand. So it turns out that Adam Smith used to believe that markets were guided by these invisible hands that allocated resources to its highest valued use. Okay, so prices guide self-interested households and firms to make decisions that lead to society's economic well-being. Okay, so it's like an invisible hand is going to guide our actions, and even when households and firms are individually looking into doing what's best for themselves, that actually turns out to be the to produce the highest well-being for society. So before we start principle number 7, let's finish by saying that even when markets are a good way of organizing economic activity, there's still a role for governments. But I also want to talk about what would be the opposite of having a market economy, in which you have thousands of buyers and thousands of sellers that determine the price of a good or service, and then how resources are allocated in the economy. Well, instead of having that, we could have something called a centralized economy, right? So a centralized economy, for example, in Cuba, they have a centralized economy, and North Korea, they have a centralized economy. So what happens is that one person or a group of people are going to decide how resources are allocated in the economy. So what does this mean? It means that one person or one entity are going to decide who gets to produce what, who gets to consume what, how many pounds of beef, how many pounds of chicken we get, how many pounds of rice, how many pounds of bread, right? If they also get to determine the what every person is going to work on, right? What is going to be produced overall in the economy. So let's think about it for a second. Even when we had a benevolent central planner, so central planner would be the person in charge of deciding how resources are allocated in the economy. Even if we had the central planner that had the best intentions, then there would still be a problem, right? Because this central planner would not have complete information. So he would not have complete information, he, she, or they would not have complete information on what are my tastes, what do I like, and what do I value the most, right? What am I good at? What do I want to work on? And so on, right? So uh, even if we had a central planner that is benevolent, it's still not an ideal situation because they would not have complete information on how to best allocate the resources in the economy. Okay, now we're going to talk about principle number 7. We said that markets are okay, or they're a good way of organizing economic activity, but sometimes there's a use for the government, right? So every economist has agreed that the main role of the government is to enforce property rights. Okay, they have to enforce rules and maintain institutions that are key to the market economy. So people are going to be less inclined to work, produce, invest, or purchase if there is a large risk of their property being stolen. So we rely on government provided police and courts to enforce our rights over the things we produce. Okay, so every single economist agrees that the main role of the government, the first and foremost, most important role of the government should be to protect property rights. And this is very important because without the adequate enforcement of property rights, markets would not work. Apart from protecting property rights, there are other reasons why government should exist. Uh, One of the main reasons is to avoid market failures. So, what's the definition of market failures? Market failures are when a market left on its own fails to allocate resources efficiently. Okay. Two examples or main examples of market failures are negative externalities and market power. So, externality is a source of market failure. Um, the definition of externality is when the production or consumption of a good affects bystander. For example, pollution, right? So let's suppose that we have a new car factory opening in town, right? So let's suppose that Tesla moves into our neighborhood. So everybody is going to be super happy that we have a new factory in town because it's going to employ many workers and it's going to employ engineers, it's going to employ techs, it's going to employ managers and so on, right? And it's going to be a source of employment and it's probably going to pay taxes so that we can beautify the city and have some more parks, maybe a few more schools, and make the neighborhood better. Now, the only problem is that factories usually produce or come with pollution, right? So there could be contamination of the local water source or contamination of the air, right? Pollution of the air. So that's a negative externality. So that the factory did not really come or did not really open to produce pollution, right? It didn't really open to contaminate the air or the water, right? But this is a byproduct of in the production or consumption of a specific good, right? So that's externality. Now, the second possible source of market failure is market power. So what happens with market power is that you have a single buyer or seller that has substantial influence on a market price. So the main example of having too much market power is a monopolist, right? So the monopolist would be the sole producer of a specific good or service in a market, right? So since they are the sole producer of this good, then they have a lot of market power and they can charge almost whatever price that they want, right? Or they can charge a much higher price than if there were several producers of the same good, right? So this is so prevalent that if you take a look at the list of many billionaires, then you can see that a lot of them are monopolies, right? For example, think of Bill Gates, or there is a billionaire in Mexico that he is a telecommunications mogul. His name is Carlos Slim, and for many years he was the sole provider of phone service in all Mexico. So because of that reason, he used to charge much higher prices for phone service and cell phone service than what we would see in the United States. So that's two reasons to correct for externalities or to provide antitrust laws so that there won't be a sole producer or a sole provider of a specific good or service, or so that a company doesn't acquire too much or accumulate too much market power. So that's why we have governments, right? To correct for market failures. So some economists believe that government should also promote equality, right? Remember with equality, we said that it was the equal distribution of resources in the economy. So what governments would do is that they would avoid disparities in economic well-being, and they use tax or welfare policies to change how the economic pie is divided. So there would be some transfer to people some transfers to people that may need it the most, right? So all economists agree that government should protect property rights, and also that they should um, correct market failures, such as, like we said, externalities, and provide antitrust laws to fight market power, right? Or to avoid companies from having too much market power. But not every economist agrees that government should promote equality. Some economists think that governments need to do that. Some things they don't. Some economists think that governments should not always promote equality. This is category number three, and this is going to describe how the economy works as a whole. Okay, this category, guys, this category is related to macroeconomics, the subject that we will be discussing for the rest of the class. Okay. So far, categories one and two, they are related to microeconomics. Now we're going to talk about the principles that relate specifically to macroeconomics. Principle number eight is a country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services. Principle number nine would be prices rise when the government prints too much money. And principle number 10 would be society faces a short run trade off between inflation and unemployment. So we'll discuss this in a minute. Principle number eight says that a country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services. So there's huge variation in living standards across countries over time, right? So it says in here in your notes that in 2017, sorry, the average income for the US was 60,000 and for Nigeria is 6,000. Right now, it's currently about the same for the United States, about $60,000. So that means that the average income in the United States is 10 times higher than the average income in Nigeria, right? And so that means that we in the United States enjoy a much higher standard of living that they do in Nigeria and in most developing countries and even in most developed countries, right? So what we need to discuss is what causes these differences in the standard of living between countries. So there is one culprit. So there is one reason that can explain the differences in the standard of living between the countries in the world, and that is productivity. So productivity is the quantity of goods and services produced from each unit of labor input. So productivity is the most important determinant of living standards. So that means that the average US worker is a lot more productive than many other workers in the world, right? So productivity is going to depend on a lot of factors. So some of the factors are equipment, skills, and education that make up human capital, but most importantly, technology. The technology available to workers is going to have a huge impact on productivity. So what do we mean by technology? So the technology are the recipes that we use to produce goods and services. Okay. So when we have good technology or when we improve in our technology, then we're able to produce more goods and services with the current resources that we have in the economy. So that's why if technology increases productivity, and then productivity would lead to an increase in the standard of living in the economy. Principle number nine says that prices rise when the government prints too much money. So this leads to inflation. The definition of inflation is an increase in the overall level of prices in the economy. So it turns out that in the long run, inflation is mostly caused by an excessive growth in the quantity of money. And what happens is that the faster the government creates the money, the greater the inflation rate. So back in the day, after the World Wars, Germany was forced to pay reparation debts. And then, since they really didn't have a lot of money because they just went through a world war, then they had to print too much money, or they printed too much money in order to pay the reparation debts. That led to a hyperinflation period. A hyperinflation period is when the inflation rate is greater than 50%. So that means that in 1 year, prices grow 50% more than they did the previous year. Okay. So the prices are growing a lot during that time. So that caused a hyperinflation period in Germany. So the U.S. doesn't really have a long tradition of hyperinflations, but there's many countries in the world that have experienced that. For example, Venezuela, Argentina, like I said, Germany, Zimbabwe, they have all had periods of hyperinflation, where what happened was that the government printed too much money. Now, principle number 10, and our last principle, and probably the most important principle in macroeconomics that we'll cover, is that society faces a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In the short run, there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So many economic policies push inflation and unemployment in opposite direction. Other factors can make this trade-off more or less favorable, but the trade-off is always present. So, for example, currently our unemployment rate is not too high, but our inflation rate is higher, right? And not and maybe a couple of years ago, our unemployment rate was high because we were recovering from the COVID recession, but the inflation rate was low. So there is a trade-off between these goals, right? So turns out that public policy most likely is not able to control both at the same time. So if they decide to fight inflation, then it will come at a cost in terms of unemployment. Or if they decide to lower unemployment, it would most likely at some point lead to a higher inflation. So there is a short run trade off between inflation and unemployment. In a nutshell, in this chapter, we cover 10 principles of economics. And these 10 principles of economics can be divided in three categories. Okay, so category number one, that has to do with microeconomics or is studied under the umbrella of microeconomics, is how individuals make decisions. So the principles covered were people face trade offs among alternative goods, the cost of an action is measured in terms of foregone opportunities, that describes opportunity cost. Rational people think at the margin, and then people change their behavior in response to incentives they face. So these are all principles that have to do with individual decision making, and they are studied under the microeconomics umbrella. The second category of the principles of economics is interactions among people. So there are these principles that are related to how people interact. So the first one is trade. Trade can be beneficial, right? Because we said that it leads to specialization and a higher variety of goods and services, right? So people can specialize on what they do best, and then all able to enjoy a greater variety um, of goods and services. It promotes competition, it lowers the price of goods and services, and it makes everyone better off, right? The second one is that markets are usually a good way of organizing economic activity. Remember, if we didn't have decentralized decisions of buyers and sellers deciding how resources are allocated, then we would have a central planner. And even when the central planner was benevolent, that is not the best idea because the central planner would not have complete information on what we want, what we need, what we would like to produce, and what resources we value highly. And the third one is even when markets are a good way of organizing economic activity, there is potentially a role for the government. Why? Because governments protect property rights. Proper governments can correct market failures, and some economists believe that one of the roles of government is to promote equality. And then but not least, we have the three chapters that describe how the economy works as a whole. So the principles that are covered under this category that talks about macroeconomics. So categories one and two are micro, Category number three is macroeconomics. That is what we're going to be studying in the rest of the semester. It says that productivity is the ultimate source of living standards. The second one is growth in the quantity of money is the ultimate source of inflation. And then number three is that the society, in the short run, this is very important, only in the short run, faces a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you.